Wait, why did the engineer crash?
What is the engineer?
In a previous video in this series, I explored what I thought the engineer is, which was a monstrous AI in a robotic body. In a second video, I then deep dived into a viewer theory that I realised I actually preferred.
There are links in the description to both of these, and why not subscribe so you can keep up with the rest of my nonsense? Or maybe consider becoming a member. Members get early access to all my videos. The second theory is that the engineer is actually a biomass that has taken over the engineer's body. In other words, although we are the engineer, the character we play is not actually from the engineer's culture and is instead some sort of pretender or infiltrator. Think The Thing from the movie.
Unfortunately, awesome though that theory was, it created a bit of a tricky situation for me, as I'd mapped out and mostly written this follow-up, and that was all based on my original theory. The biomass theory opens up some intriguing extra possibilities that might also be better explanations than what I originally had. Sorry, that's probably a bit confusing. First, let me summarise my original theory. Then we'll get to the problems with it and what the other possibilities are.
It was the biters what done it. Basically, it was all tied into the biters.
You see, I have this theory that the biters aren't native to Nauvis, or even to the whole system. I want to explore that theory more fully in a dedicated video, but my original point was going to be that the engineer's culture seeded Nauvis with the biters.
The engineer was then carrying more biters to Fulgora to seed that planet too.
Why they were doing all this is what I'll talk about in the biter video, but take it as read that they had a reason.
However, something then went wrong. While harvesting Promethium, there was an accident and the main ship that brought the engineer's people to Nauvis was destroyed. This accident throws lots of asteroids and debris into the Nauvis system. The engineer's ship, which is collecting biters for transport, gets hit, which sets the biters free on board. They then eat the pilot. The engineer's ship crashes back down onto Nauvis, and the game begins. The fact they were gathering biters was why the crash is relatively minor. They're not going super fast, so it's a survivable crash.
But now, the engineer has a real problem. They're alone on a Nauvis teeming with hostile life.
Incidentally, close to the actual crash site there was lots of debris, so that's why you have a clear area where you crash. It might also have been where the engineer was gathering those biters from. The evidence.
Let's do a quick rundown of some of what I think is the evidence for this theory.
Firstly, I definitely don't think the engineer is a native to the Nauvis system. I also don't think that they were on their own. The ship that crashes is quite small. Indeed, it's way too small for a ship that would be capable of making and sustaining a crew on an interstellar journey.
The crash was survivable, suggesting the ship was not moving that fast.
By that I mean that it wasn't travelling at speeds close to that of light, which you'd expect to be a requirement for interstellar travel to be viable. And low speeds means it was on some sort of local journey. The ship itself also has wings, which you don't need unless you're going into an atmosphere. Next, the biters are weird. More on that in the other video, especially in how aggressive they are. And the fact this aggression is directed towards pollution is also odd.
While I'm sure that most animals don't like pollution, they don't go and organise themselves into attack parties and then go and destroy the sources of that pollution.
Indeed, I don't think most animals would have the capacity to understand that the engineer's machines were the source of the pollution and that destroying them was how you make it stop. Space Age also shows that they can be captured by technology that the engineer is capable of.
If you buy the premise from my engineer videos that we are recreating their existing technology, then why would they have a technology for capturing and maintaining biters?
As a preview of some later videos, I think it's all connected. The big hint is the Promethium science. That's what this is all about.
They came here for the Promethium, they shattered Bob for the Promethium.
So that, in summary, was my original, much longer video. And while I think this still works if we are playing a biomass imposter engineer, the biomass offers up the possibility of some other likely scenarios.
So let's explore those.
Discovering the biomass. I think the most likely scenario is that the biomass was taking over a member of the crew and was discovered in the act. In my video deep diving into the biomass theory, this was what the commenter, Jackson Knock, suggested.
The idea is that the biomass was caught in the act and was trying to escape.
For example, the engineer's people could have been busy shattering Bob and hoovering up its delicious promethium innards. The biomass sees its opportunity to take over another engineer, but it's caught in the act. The engineers try to kill it, so it escapes using this short-range ship. It flees deeper into the Nauvis system, hoping the asteroids would put off its pursuers, but it's not a very good pilot and hits an asteroid which causes it to crash into Nauvis. Or perhaps it just decides to crash into Nauvis, hoping the engineers would assume it's dead and leave.
Once the coast is clear, it emerges and then tries to do what it does. But it finds the only organic life on Nauvis, and then the other planets, are the non-sapient biters.
This is why we don't do anything like try to take them over in the base game. There's no real point.
As a theory, I think this does make a lot of sense. But I'd say the main thing it doesn't explain is the reason that the engineer's people aren't there when we get into space.
I think we're safe to assume that the biomass engineer's crash happened quite soon after it was discovered and fled. So, if the engineer's people were still shattering Bob, then where are they? Did they just decide to leave in the relatively short time between our crash and us getting to the shattered planet?
Why? There's loads of promethium left, and it's an awful long way to come not to grab all of it.
One possible explanation is that they had filled up their cargo hold and simply went back home with it. Perhaps they intended to return later to grab more. But this seems a bit odd to me. If they're making multiple trips, then the promethium would get spread out and more difficult to collect. So wouldn't they send automated ships back with the ore and then keep working? Or, if the engineers left because they'd finished setting up some automated mining operation, then where is it? We don't encounter anything that hints at a promethium mining operation.
But then space is pretty big, so perhaps we just missed it?
Other biomass options. Another possibility is that the engineers have nothing to do with the Nauvis system, Bob, or any of that. It's all just a coincidence.
Perhaps the engineers are simply passing by. The biomass is discovered, and then it flees to the Nauvis system because it sees all of the asteroids and thinks it can shake its pursuers.
This scenario gives us a more plausible explanation as to why the engineers' people left, which is that they weren't really ever arriving. And if they did pursue the engineer, they figured the biomass was either dead in the crash or simply wasn't going anywhere.
It's certainly possible, but that's a massive set of coincidences.
Space is big and empty, so the odds of finding a planetary system full of asteroids because a planet has recently been shattered just at the time you need to escape some pursuers have got to be vanishingly small. This theory also does nothing to explain the shattered planet itself.
A tweak to this is that the engineers didn't actually discover the biomass. Perhaps it took over one of the engineers and then just left the mothership.
And in that case, its crashing into Nauvis was a straightforward accident. Of course, this theory has even more holes. Why did it leave if it didn't need to? Where was it intending to go in such a short-range ship?
There are possible answers. Was it looking for something? Did it know it was in the Nauvis system? Was it actually a Fulgoran and was trying to get home? But none of those are reflected in the game, so they don't feel like anything more than idle speculation. And of course, I've never done any idle speculation ever.
Tweaked for a biomass.
As you can tell, I'm not really convinced by all these other options. They're possible, but I don't feel they're very likely. Instead, I prefer a tweaked version of my original theory.
In this scenario, the underlying reasons for the accident, the something goes wrong, is the crew discovering the biomass taking over the engineer. It's the ensuing panic from this discovery that is the reason the biters escape. And this leads to the crash, which kills the rest of the crew as well as the biters that are on board. The tough old biomass is the only survivor.
In a darker version of this, I imagine the biomass eats the crew's remains to help it recover. Either way, this is the start of the game.
This version doesn't explain where the rest of the engineers go, though. My thinking here is that perhaps our biomass isn't the only biomass. While our crew are busy crashing into Nauvis, the other biomasses are having a whale of a time taking over the mothership. And once they have, they simply head off to a new system to keep spreading. One biomass being left behind, and apparently dead in a crash, doesn't really bother them. Or perhaps there was also a big accident as well, with the mothership getting destroyed. In this scenario, I think the mothership would slam into the shattered remains of Bob, which they were carefully breaking apart for Promethium. I think this could then be why there are so many asteroids throughout the system. They were pushed there by this big accident. And the reason we don't find any mothership leftovers is simply that it's been obliterated, broken down into bits so small we can't really tell they're there. Other options.
As you can tell, my main theory retains some key components. The engineers shattered Bob deliberately to get at the Promethium. Our ship was not the main mothership, it's a craft for local journeys. The mothership was also destroyed rather than leaving. The Bitus was spread to the nervous system by the engineers, but more on that in a separate video. The questionable parts are the reasons behind these things.
Did the engineer get taken over by a biomass? My view, yes. Did the biomass have anything to do with the mothership getting destroyed? My view, no. Did the biomass get discovered, and that led to the crash we see at the start of the game? My view, yes. But there are plenty of other possibilities, and if you think some of these are more plausible, then let me know in the comments. Innocent victims. If, as we've speculated, Bob was a rogue planet, then the engineers might not have known he was there. They just happened to plot a course near to the nervous system that should have been clear, and then wham, they hit Bob. This scenario would give us both the option of a high mass, it would be a ship big enough to hold a planet's worth of people, and or high speed, it's travelling between stars, so it's going very fast.
A problem here is that it's a bit of an odd outcome. If the engineers are capable of travelling between the stars, why didn't they spot a whole planet and crash into it?
So, perhaps Bob was shattered by someone else, and the engineer's ship crashed into the debris that they didn't know was going to be there.
In other words, we could have been an innocent victim, and we do the monstrous stuff in the game because... reasons?
It was the Fulgorans. Maybe it was the Fulgorans. After all, we know they trashed their own planet, so maybe once they were done with Fulgora, they simply moved to Bob and managed to shatter it while doing some terrible experiment. The engineers might have shown up simply to investigate what happened and crashed into the debris field.
Or perhaps all the Bob mothership stuff is nonsense, and what happened was that an automated Fulgoran defence system shot us down.
War. War never changes. I mentioned this in my Reasons for Shattering Bob video, but maybe someone is fighting a war and Bob was a target in that war, or even just an innocent bystander.
Maybe the engineers were at war with the Bobians, and the engineers blew up Bob because they don't do things by halves.
Maybe our engineer could have been the specialist who was sent to do that, or the only survivor of the fleet that was sent to shatter Bob. Just us.
One of the reasons I decided to start calling the Shattered Planet Bob is because of the Bobbyverse novel series.
Simplifying things a bit and not wanting to spoil the books too much in case you want to read them, in that series of novels by Dennis E. Taylor, the main character, called Bob, becomes an AI that's running a von Neumann probe. I quite like the parallels with my theory about the engineer being a robot AI, and this to me opens up a different set of possibilities for why the engineer is in the Nauvis system. As I've been talking about, I like the biomass theory, and that, to me, works better if the engineer is from a bigger ship full of engineers.
But if they were an AI that roams the galaxy, then we're less reliant on there being this big mothership.
The smaller ship could simply be enough to transport them around the galaxy if we don't need to consider biological lifespans. And perhaps they go into a sort of hibernation, waiting for an automated system to wake them up when they get to a new system, or they simply spend the time thinking.
They could then arrive in the Nauvis system and be an innocent victim, crashing into Bob's remains. Or, what if the engineer is an absolute monster and they broke up a whole planet just to get at some interesting looking rocks?
A mad engineer.
Or how about, to leave you with a bit more of a humorous take, the engineer is the Factorio equivalent of the mad scientist trope.
They're flying around the Factorio galaxy doing mad and weird engineering projects, and when they get to Nauvis, they find this strange planet approaching the system. It's Bob, the rogue planet, and their sensors detect it has this weird substance in it where there would normally be an iron core. Intrigued, they set about smashing the planet apart to find out what it is. They discover a new element they call Promethium and set about investigating how they can use it. Only things go wrong, and they get hit by the debris and crash on Nauvis.
but they can't get this new substance out of their mind. They have to get back into space to find it and continue their work.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. As I explained at the top of the video, I had to do quite a major rewrite on this video, but it was quite interesting in its own way. I should maybe have spent a bit more time explaining my theory, but the video was getting long and I wanted to do it in a different style, blast out the core theory like a sort of short story, then speculate around it. If you want to get up to speed on my speculations about Bob, then the video on screen is as good a starting point as any. Oh, and the other reason for picking Bob for the Shadow Planet is I've been a huge fan of Blackadder since I was a kid, and the way Rowan Atkinson says Bob always cracked me up. The parallel with Bob being this planet that's not quite what it seemed quite apt to me.